going to be building on what we talked about in chapter 3 and 4 when we get back to when I mentioned that the ancient philosophy of studying ethics had a tripod, and I told you about virtue ethics as one leg of that tripod, and I mentioned deontology as another, and consequentialism. We're going to be talking about those two other legs, and that is utilitarianism and the categorical imperative. So we'll get right into those. The first being utilitarianism. This is based on the idea of consequentialism, and that is that our decisions have consequences, and we make those decisions by weighing those consequences. So the utilitarian approach that leaders would take would be for a leader to consider, am I doing what's best for the most? And obviously this is very tough, and this would be in an ethical dilemma where there are no clear right or wrong answers to the problem. You just have to make the answer that you as a leader might consider the best. And this is things that you might think about in terms of macro level political decisions, in times of conflict between nations, and even in organizations when you have a decision where you have to do what's right for the most number of people in your organization, even if you realize that there may be some people in departments or parts of the organization that may not benefit from your decision. But that would be a utilitarian approach. You are basing it on the consequences that will benefit the most people. The other one that we're going to talk about is Kant's categorical imperative. And this is this idea of deontology, or a deontological perspective, or duty, my duty to do what is right. And it is a more kind of severe or extreme position because it's based on this idea. When we say the categorical imperative, categorical means regardless of consequences. So we would do what is right regardless of the consequences, simply based on right versus wrong, period. And we would not consider these external consequences as a factor. So you would do with this without exception. And you ask yourself, in order to determine this, you kind of consider universal principles, but guided by your own internal moral compass. And so you can see this can be problematic when you have internal moral compasses that differ. Maybe somebody who's a psychopath, that's internal moral compass is internally flawed. But the way to kind of gauge this is you would ask yourself, would you want everyone to make the exact same decision? And if you would want everyone to make that same decision, it's probably guided by a universal principle, and it's probably following like universal law. You would always treat humanity as the end, not the tool. Okay? So there's a video clip that you're going to have just kind of making a distinction between these two. And you may have seen it. It's an illustrative little clip called Kant's Axe. We're going to play it for you now.
If a sinister-looking man carrying an axe knocked on your door and asked you where your best friend was, would it be morally acceptable to tell a lie? Immanuel Kant, surprisingly, thought it wouldn't. The example of the would-be murderer is his. Tell the truth is what Kant called a categorical imperative, an absolute duty, one without exceptions. It applies to everyone, whatever the consequences. In fact, Kant argued that if you told a lie which, by chance, led to the axeman finding your friend, that would be on your conscience. So if you tell the axeman that your friend is not in the house when he is, and your friend then sneaks out the back door and bumps into the axeman, anything that then happens is, to some extent, your responsibility. But if you told the truth, then the consequences for your friend, no matter how grisly, should not be on your conscience. This brings out how different his moral stance was from utilitarianism, the philosophy that you should do whatever brings about the greatest happiness. A utilitarian would think about the consequences of telling the truth or of lying. In contrast, for Kant, some actions were just wrong, even if good consequences might flow from them. This is known as a deontological approach to ethics.
Our next ethical principle, moving on from utilitarianism and Kant's categorical imperative, which I've highlighted very briefly to give you just a very general overview of these two, is Justice as Fairness by John Rawls out of Harvard. And this is one of the more recent kind of 20th century principles. And it's looking at the idea of how societies and democratic societies try to establish justice for as many people as they can. And it talks about how we look at the idea that every person should be treated with the same basic liberties. And when you have inequality, how you try to deal with it as best as you can. And it makes a distinction between the idea of equality and justice. So if you think about equality, you think about the idea that everybody would have the same and be given the same. John Rawls saw that as something that was different than justice, because when you have two people that start out differently, one with more, the other with less, giving them the same on top of that does not equate to justice. I have a little kind of graphic that you'll see here, and it will illustrate this principle, I think, very nicely. So if you're like me and a visual learner, that helps kind of picture what I'm talking about. These have a couple of different principles, and one of those is this idea, would I want, if I were marginalized or in a marginalized group in a society, would I want to have these principles applied to me? This is something that is called the veil of ignorance. If I was unaware of my position in a society, what would I want to have for myself? The next ethical principle is also a little one that's a little bit more contemporary, and this would be pragmatism. This is John Dewey's kind of approach. And when we think about pragmatists, we think about people who approach ethical decision-making processes kind of systematically in looking at all the possible outcomes and all the possible options before a decision is made. It's kind of a scientific inquiry approach. It's something that is very practical, and it hopefully will result in a decision that is very logical and therefore the best of several different possible scenarios. And when I say the word scenario, I choose that very deliberately because it also involves this idea that Burke had of dramatic rehearsal, which is where you kind of envision all of your scenarios and build your scenarios into your possible decision making. And therefore you're able to kind of do this dramatic rehearsal in order to foresee potential obstacles, pitfalls, and then do your problem solving on that front end. The final one is altruism. And this, many of you, when you hear it, you think very spiritually, depending on, or regardless maybe of religious influence, but this idea of other before self, a servant's heart, and maybe the Good Samaritan comes to mind, that, parable of being able to help somebody even if that person might be your enemy. But obviously it's the love of your neighbor, helping others, being somebody who is willing to work in charities. An ethical standard would be that people are never a means to an end, and that you obviously would be involved in a movement simply for the sake of helping others, not for any gain that it would bring to yourself. The final thing I want you to think about, and I did mention this in the last two chapters, was this idea of the bystander effect. Sometimes we're called to act in a situation where we're unsure what to do, and we do weigh the options. And obviously self-preservation and taking care of ourselves becomes one of the options we have to consider. And I would never encourage anybody to put yourself in danger in order to, to do something foolish. But I do encourage you to think about others and being other-minded in your decision-making processes, because when you watch this video on the bystander effect, it's very... I don't know, it kind of brings to light the fact that we do look to see what others are doing before we ourselves act, and it could cost somebody crucial time if they're in need of our assistance. And so I would just encourage you to be that person who would act first in giving assistance, just as you would want someone to do for you.
One of the most powerful parables in the Bible is that of the Good Samaritan. A man is passing by, seeing a stranger lying on the road, and the Bible is on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, that many, many people have passed by and done nothing to help this suffering person. But the man from Samaria, the Good Samaritan, gets down off his camel, helps the man, brings him to an inn, gives the innkeeper money, checks on him to see that he's surviving and doing well. The idea is you should treat everyone as you would want them to treat you. It's the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It promotes the notion of social community, a sense in which, of reciprocity, we all should help one another if we ever want others to help us. But that Good Samaritan rule often gets challenged because in many situations, people who are in need don't get the support they need. People pass them by, and that's called the bystander effect, the bystander indifference. So again, while you're watching this film clip, keep thinking, would I help? Would I intervene? What are the forces in that situation that would make me help? Or what keeps me, like most people, from helping, from being passive, in some cases from being indifferent to the suffering of my fellows?
Watch a pickpocket in action. The woman with the rucksack is his victim, and the man in the grey top on the left is the thief. Except they're both acting. In fact, everyone in the queue is with us, apart from the man in the blue shirt. As the thief moves in, will our bystander notice? He clearly has. What's more, he's seen that other people in the queue have noticed too. Now, what's he going to do about it? The answer is nothing. After all, no one else in the queue reacts, so why should he? Chances are, you wouldn't have done anything either. Whatever the man in the blue shirt thinks he's seen, he's influenced by the apathy of everyone else in the queue. In more serious situations, this could have disturbing consequences. Liverpool Street Station in London. A drunk lies on the pavement. In fact, he's our actor, Peter, but these passers-by aren't to know that. And since he looks the worse for wear, not critically ill, they ignore him. Helping would be inconvenient or even risky. He lies there for 20 minutes and no one raises an eyebrow. This time, we've dressed Peter as a respectable city gent. How long before he's rescued now that he looks the part?
Hello, sir. How are you today?
I'm all right, thanks.
6 seconds. She even calls him sir. And suddenly, everyone's a good Samaritan.
Do you suffer from epilepsy?
No.
While you're lying on the floor in the rain?
After a couple of minutes, even the police turn up.
I would just hate to be in his position of feeling ill and nobody helping and walking past, so I'd just like to check that he was okay.
I thought, well, it's wet, so he must really be ill because he's going to ruin his suit anyway.
Our actress Ruth takes Peter's place. She's not a drunk, but she's also not a city gent. How long before she gets help? Four minutes have passed, and 34 people have passed.
People don't really want to know that they just haven't got the time. Well, they have got the time, they just don't want to get involved.
But it's more complicated than that. If the street were deserted, a passerby would probably go to the rescue. But these strangers have silently formed a temporary group with a rule: don't help. This woman, for instance, has clearly spotted Ruth, but she conforms to the rule and does nothing.
You all right? You all right?
Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
You all right? You sure?
She suddenly finds herself in a different group with a new rule: to help.
She don't look well, does she?
You all right? Yeah. You sure?
First I thought she was dead, then I sort of checked to see if she was breathing or not. And I looked around and I couldn't believe that no one had noticed her, because there was a bloke sat there just absorbed in reading a newspaper.
Peter's now having the same problem. This time, we've swapped his suit for casual clothes. He's not drunk, and we've asked him to act like he's in pain.
Help! Help! Help me! Please, somebody! Help me! Help me, somebody! Please help me! Help me! Help me! Help me! Please, somebody help me! Please, somebody help me!
I got onto the tube and sat opposite a guy who threatened me. He'd obviously been sleeping rough and had problems, but he was quite verbally abusive.
Yeah, I was with a group of mates one day. We've seen two fellas arguing. We've literally turned the corner discussed a few things, came back, and that was it, they were fighting.
I'd got up to walk away from him, he'd followed me, and he sat beside me for 6 or 7 stops, actually threatened to stab me.
We've had a little discussion between each other if we should stop it or not. We decided not to, so we was on our way.
And I was looking at the other passengers and looking at the guard on the carriage, hoping that somebody would help me.
We should have really done something, because at the end of the day, how'd we like it if it was us?
Nobody did anything on the tube. People just ignored me completely. When the guy eventually got off, then people came up and asked if I was okay, but during the journey they'd done nothing.
And that's when the guilt tripped in. We really did realise that it was wrong what we did. How'd you do it? How'd you feel when someone's beating 10 times out of someone? I mean, it could have been me, you, anyone, but deep down we bottled it.
It's always very distressing to watch situations like this where people are obviously suffering and no one's actually helping them. But what we have here is 2 conflicting rules. One is the rule that we ought to help, and the other is the rule that we ought to do what everybody else is doing. And here you have effectively a group of strangers who are exerting the pressure not to intervene, not to help, and it's very difficult to rebel.
I have a very brief example, and this has nothing to do with somebody who's in need of assistance. It just has to do with somebody who was a role model to me in a very simple way. I was standing having a cup of coffee by the window in my front room, and I was just kind of looking out, and students were heading to the bus stop. And there was a very young girl who was kind of skipping along heading to the bus stop, and there were several other people, parents walking their kids, other kids, teenagers. There were a lot of buses coming. And there was trash blowing, like a trash bag had split open the day before for trash day. And all these people were passing by the trash. And this one little girl stopped and started picking up all the trash. And as soon as she started doing it, several others started following suit and picking up all that trash. I thought to myself, that's exactly who I want to be as a leader. I want to be the person who stops and picks up the trash first and sets that example for my followers, rather than the person who passes by the trash and ignores it and waits for somebody else to do it first.